Hello and welcome to Upper Pen. My name is Dakota, and today I'm talking with AK Mulford about their newest book, The Amethyst Kingdom. So we're going to actually talk about the beginning of the series and probably A River of Golden Bones more, but um, just a forewarning.
Sounds good. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. Can you give us a rundown of what the series is?
Sure. Um, so the Five Crowns of Okrith is the series. There's 5 books in the series. It's a high fantasy romance series where it's set in a fictitious world that has witches and fae and power dynamics and magic. And each book in the series takes place in a different court and has a different main couple. But there's also kind of like an overarching villain to the world as well that kind of threads throughout the series. So you kind of get like a new romance in each book whilst also getting kind of the epic fantasy of it all too.
So I love it when authors do this, where I can have different couples, because then I
Mhm.
don't have to like witness them breaking up and like doing awful things to each other to
Yeah.
like build tension.
Yeah. I know once they fall in love, I'm not interested anymore. It's like I want them to be happy forever. I don't want to split them apart again and again and come up with more extreme ways for them to find their way back to each other. Like I kind of like them to just be have their happy story, but the characters in the first few books still pop up throughout the series, so you kind of get to see their lives evolve still while still getting like that kind of falling in love all over again. So yeah, that's my favorite.
So one of the main aspects that drew me to the books is there's a lot of queer representation and there's a lot of queer romance, which is not always as common as you might think. So I
Yeah.
love that.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I really wanted to have all kind of different relationships within the LGBTQIA plus community. For me being a queer person, I feel like there's maybe one or two types of queer representation that we get in fantasy that's starting to become more common, which is fantastic. But I really wanted to kind of expand upon that and kind of encourage people to think about the fact that there's lots of different kinds of queer people, lots of different kinds of queer representation, and that some of the couples in my series might seem very straight passing from the outset, but aren't. And um, so I kind of wanted to give people the opportunity to kind of see themselves in more of these characters and think about that a little bit more. And I do think that the series kind of becomes almost more overtly queer in the romance as it goes on, where it's like, okay, so you've got this little taster, and now we're going to just go more and more as we go.
I mean, it fits so wonderfully though, because I re actually read A River of Golden Bones first. And that one talks a lot about gender identity. And so I thought it was like a really great look at gender identity in fiction and how it can work to move a plot. And I don't know, I loved it so much.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I really wanted something that was a bit different from like the non-binary perspective, especially for me as a non-binary person who's married to a man. I think that the kind of gender discovery is almost discredited in some ways, where you're kind of viewed as like, oh, well, it doesn't really matter because of your relationship, and you're kind of treated as only existing in reference to the people around you. And so that was so much of that character story was realizing that they are who they are outside of anyone else and kind of like stop, kind of encouraged to stop looking outside of themselves and instead look within to kind of figure out who they are while still giving you all the like fantasy romance tropes and like the battles and the monsters and the magic. So I wanted it to be the kind of like romantasy we all know and love while still kind of giving people an opportunity to see a different kind of main character in that story. Yeah.
I loved it. And the other books too, the ones that we're supposed to be talking about, um, are very similar in that the characters still find themselves, which I find so wonderful in fantasy.
Yeah, I feel like there's something for me as an author and as a reader that is beautiful about fantasy because it kind of highlights these epic emotions inside of us in a way that I almost feel like can be more honest than contemporary in some ways. Like, when you're that age and you're trying to figure out who you are and what you want and step into your power and find your voice, it does feel like, you're battling dragons, it feels that epic. So it's kind of nice having that duality of these epic moments with these really intimate ones of just kind of like inner thoughts and things at the same time as having the kind of magic and battles and things. Yeah.
So in the first book, the characters can actually glamour themselves, which I think is so fun to play with, but also horrifying to think about in real life.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and I feel like it's kind of a metaphor too for kind of coming into your own and realizing like without too many spoilers, one of the characters is kind of so comfortable being this other person that they don't know how to like become who they truly are anymore. And I think that a lot of us growing up, and especially within like the neurodivergent community, I can speak for that, feel like we're kind of putting on a role of someone else and kind of masking for so much of our youth. And then you realize like, oh, actually, I need to kind of shed this persona and really just be who I truly am. So a lot of that story is kind of like a metaphor for kind of unmasking and stepping into yourself. Yeah.
So it works really well in this fantasy setting, just on so many levels. Like you said, it really is like a metaphor, um, but very literal at the same time. I feel
Yeah.
it. So the the series has 5 books, and each one follows a different couple. The first one is, oh my gosh, I forgot her name.
Remy,
Remy,
Remy and
thank you.
yeah.
And then the second one is her sister Rua.
Hmm.
Yep. And
Run, yeah.
and then the third one is a non-binary character again, correct?
The third one's the sapphic one. So the
Oh,
third one
yes.
is two female characters. Yeah.
Yes.
It's a bodyguard sapphic romance. And then the fourth book is a non-binary romance.
So I love the tropes. Oh my God. I
Yeah.
would die for the tropes here.
I love a good like allies to lovers, enemies to lovers, kind of begrudgingly forced to work together, to lovers. And each book has like kind of a different trope to it. So, some are like the fourth book is kind of a friends to lovers forced marriage, the third one's like bodyguard. So yeah, it's fun.
And then the fifth one is enemies to friends to lovers. Is that how it goes? Or was
It's It's basically like friends to lovers to enemies and to lovers. So when the book picks up, it's a second chance romance, and I had a lot of fun with this one because there is so much angst to it because they've already been together. They kind of know each other, they know how to push each other's buttons, but they broke each other's hearts and then haven't seen each other in a really, really long time. And Karis, who's the main character of the book, is trying to basically enter this competition for the crown, the last crown in the kind of continent. And her ex-fated mate shows up and is trying to also win the crown and really derails all of her efforts and kind of, just drudges up all of these old feelings and things and still knows kind of just how to get to her and stuff like that. So there's like a lot of angst, a lot of like hurt feelings, but also still, when somebody has been your best friend, you always have that kind of shorthand with each other, even when you don't want to. So yeah, it was really fun writing those two.
so um I really enjoy these like tropes, but they don't feel too tropey either. So in the first one with Remy, it's very much a hidden hidden romance, I guess. I don't really know how to
Yeah,
describe
like
it.
secret identities, allies to lovers. Yeah.
But it never feels forced or like pushy almost. It just feels like they're angry at each other for a lot of it because they're so annoyed that they like each other.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, like I've definitely had that in relationships before where I'm like, really, like you are here now. I'm trying to do all sorts of other stuff and you've just showed up and now I'm in love with you. And like and I really can't be right now because I've got a whole bunch of other stuff going on. And I think that we've all like kind of had that moment where we're like, oh, like I can't deny these feelings, but I'm gonna really try to.
Sometimes I still feel like that with my husband.
Yeah.
I want to be angry with you right now, you know?
Yeah.
Um, the magic system is really interesting as well because in the first book with Remy, we learn about witches and how the different witches have different powers.
Yeah.
So run us through that idea.
I mean, I guess I wanted to keep the world both interesting but simple in some ways because I didn't want it to take away from like the romance and the more kind of emotional intimate moments. And while I love epic fantasy, sometimes I think you can get stuck in the minutia of the magic systems, and for some people that's like the goal of their story is to have these beautifully complex worlds. But for me, especially as someone with ADHD, I'm like, right, okay, here we go. There's a, I want to get you caught up on this world so that I can tell you about this romance. And so there's 5 types of witches that are kind of native to each of these different courts, and they each have different kinds of magic. Um, and a lot of that is inspired by kind of real life witchy people and things where there's kind of, kitchen witches and sea witches and different people who are into different kinds of, that sort of paganism and things like that. And then I wanted more kind of fantastical ones too, like the ability to like animate and levitate objects and things like that. So each one has like a different magic system that's corresponded with a color. And those are the colors of each of the 5 books as well, that kind of go with each of the courts within the world. And I liked that from both like a kind of color coded perspective, but also they're kind of like, the Spice Girls in a way. Like it's almost like a little boy band of like, each one's got their own thing going on. I just quite liked that idea.
So because I have I'm assuming because I have like depression and my brain doesn't always work to like make connections, the simplicity and the color coding helped so much with like I know what's happening because I know the system.
Yes, totally. I didn't want it to be too complicated for people. I feel like I definitely write for neurodivergent people and for people who want to get right into the kind of connections of the story. So I wanted it to be like both whimsical and fantastical and magical and people to understand those elements, but to give them a shorthand to it too.
Yeah, it just made it very approachable. And like the woman that I talked to last, her book was wonderful, but it was had a very high barrier to entry for me because she was
Mm.
building the world so much. And it was beautiful and wonderful, and the story's great. It's just difficult to read all at once, you know?
Totally. I feel really honored how many people have said that like my books are kind of a gateway into fantasy romance for them because it isn't too high intensity as far as the world building goes. So it's kind of like they read it and they go, actually, this is kind of fun. And then they kind of find more and more complex worlds through them. So yeah.
But you did a lot of really great world building too. So like, I'm not saying that's not there.
I actually wanted to kind of the world of Okrith is kind of a love story to all the countries I've lived in. So each one is kind of based on a country that I've lived and worked in. So you know, we've got like New Zealand and South Africa and Guatemala and you know, so the UK, US. So yeah, that was kind of my goal with that. So I hope that when people are, you know, in the Western court, it feels like, you know, they can like it smells different, the textures are different, you know, the sense of humor is different, like you know, everything about it, the color palette of the landscape and the wildlife. And so I hope there's something about that that kind of can immediately drop people into a sense of place without having to take like 10 pages of description, you know?
Yeah, it does very much evoke like memories of places I've been. So they're in the woods for the first book for a very long time, and I'm like, I've been here. I live here.
Yeah.
But then she starts smelling salt on the air, and I'm like, I've felt this as well, you know, like I can feel these things.
Mhm. Yes. I mean, I've used to be a wildlife biologist, so I've spent a lot of my time living outdoors or in places that didn't have, you know, electricity and things like that. So, for me, that kind of connection with nature is one of the things I love about fantasy and kind of, you know, all of the different landscapes and forests and ecosystems. So that's definitely in my books.
How did you go from wildlife biologist to writer?
Yeah, I mean, I think both were always in me. I from the my very youngest age, I thought either I'm going to write books or work with animals, you know, it was kind of one of those two things. And I thought, oh, well, I'll go into biology because nobody can make a living from writing. Like, you know, I just kind of was like, I don't think I can do that. And even though my family were, you know, usually it's the opposite where your family's encouraging you to like have a more realistic career. I was the one who was like, no, I don't know if I can do that. So I'll do the wildlife biology thing, which I loved and it was a great career, but you know, you get to an age where you don't really want to be like living without you know, electricity and, you know, there's only so many times like you can get dengue fever and be, you know, just like you're like, okay, I'm ready to do something else. But the whole time I was living in the jungle, I was still writing stories. You know, there was only so many like take a book, leave a book shelves where
Yeah.
you run out of books. This was before the days of Kindles, you know. And so I would write my own stories just to entertain myself and so I'd have like notebooks and notebooks filled with these books. And I think I've just always written stories like my entire life. So it wasn't until the pandemic that I decided like I really want to do something with this and I'm gonna actually really do it this time. But you know, it was kind of in there my whole life, the storytelling gene for sure.
So what you're saying is you have a ton of stories that are going to be published, right?
I don't know. I do have like this graveyard folder of all these old books. But I don't know. I don't know if I'll resurrect them and do anything with them or if they'll just kind of be like a little time capsule. Like it's interesting. Even my books that are published, I can think like when I read passages of it, it takes me, you know, in the same way when you hear a song from a certain time in your life, it takes you back to the memory of when that song first came out. It's the same with my books where I'll like, you know, see something from The Witch's Blade and be like, "Oh, I remember like it was the winter and we were in New Zealand and you know, it takes me back to those times." So yeah, they're little time capsules for me.
Um, yeah, so like that's fantastic, but also being a wildlife biologist must have been fantastic. Like I don't, you had two very fantastic careers.
It was pretty cool. Yeah, you know, I have a second pen name that's rom-coms and they're all zookeeper rom-coms, so they all have all my stories of being a wildlife biologist in them because I needed somewhere to put all these, you know, crazy stories.
well, now I'm gonna have to go look at all those now.
Yeah, I've been having fun with those. I think people are horrified that so many of those stories are actually true.
I would imagine weird things happen with wildlife. So,
All the time. I mean, it's a both telling stories and working with animals are great jobs for someone with ADHD because it's like no 2 days are the same, you know?
so the Amethyst Kingdom is actually the last book in the series. Are you gonna write any more in this world, do you think?
I mean, it's definitely going to be the last book in that series of novels, but I might, on my Patreon and things like that, I do novellas every once in a while. So I might have like a few other novellas that just kind of come out for people in the future. We shall see. I might at some point, but the Amethyst Kingdom really ended the series exactly the way I wanted from the beginning. I knew from the first book, like the location of the last scene of the last book. And so I wanted to make sure that everything kind of came around to that ending. So yeah, I don't think there'll be any more full-length books in that series, but you never know. There might be a few little short stories here and there.
Well, so I love the world for these five books, but also the world for the River of Golden Bones, because they have different types of magical creatures in them, it seems like. So there's like fae and witches, and then there's werewolves and fairies.
Yep.
So it's like this wonderful mishmash of like fantasy creatures for me.
Yes, I just can't help myself. I need to I'm like, I'll bring you into this one and you into this one. And, because A River of Golden Bones is kind of a fairy tale retelling in a way, I thought like we've got to have fairies. And I really wanted to have monsters in there as well and like lots of different mythical creatures. But I thought, kind of these wolf shifters were like such a great kind of way to explore binary and the gender binary. This idea that you can kind of shift forms and things like that was a kind of like a great way to kind of explore all of that. So I knew I wanted to do something that was like high fantasy, but bringing some of those more paranormal elements into it. Yeah.
I love that the main characters and particularly the femme main characters are like the ones who take the power too. They don't let their significant other like weasel in and like they're the king now.
Yeah, totally. I think the series is very much like I've just finished writing the third book in the series, the third and final book. And the whole series I think is very much a commentary on like the patriarchy and patriarchal structures and the ways that men kind of take voices and power from women and femmes and non-binary people and the trans community. And so I really wanted that to kind of be like the backdrop of it. I feel like in some ways the whole series is very honest to patriarchal structures throughout history as well.
Yeah.
So I wanted that to be something that in this world it was about like women and queer people and trans people finding their power in this world where only like one type of person gets to have all the control. So yeah.
It's there's such heavy topics to talk about in like romantasy books, but they work
Yeah.
so well.
I feel like, I love romantasy, but I also feel as a queer person like I have this opportunity to be able to tell these stories and I want to use my platform to bring more people into these worlds and put them in the driver's seat and let them be the heroes of these stories. And I think that, I exist in a time and place where, like trans rights are being threatened and um I'd want that to be a part of my storytelling as well. If I can use stories to highlight some of the things that are happening in the real world, sometimes in some ways, I think that people might hear them and understand them in ways that they can't when it's in like politics and in the real world. Sometimes storytelling gives us more empathy for people. So I hope that, maybe somebody picks up this book not really realizing it's, a story about like this gender fluid character and then coming out realizing like actually like I totally get where this character is coming from. So yeah, that's my goal.
Well, so it works really well. And at no point did I feel like the main criticism usually of LGBTQ plus books is like, you were shoving it down my throat the whole time, right? And it never feels like that. It just feels like a genuine experience of like exploration. Um,
Yeah.
and that's what I really want people to think about when they're reading these things.
Yeah, I hope so. I think that some people from the very first chapter, especially like my queer friends who read it, are like, oh, this is very clearly like a non-binary character. Like the fact that they don't really know how to kind of navigate the world. They're so clear in some ways and then can't make a decision to save their life in other ways. And relate so deeply with that. And then I think other people kind of get to like 70% of the way through the book and are like, oh, wait, what? Oh, okay. You know? So
Well,
it's interesting to see from like different readers' perspectives, and I think that the villain in the story is very much based off of kind of turfism and turf rhetoric as well. And like I think for some people who are experiencing that all the time, they see it very clearly. And then for other people, once you point it out to them, they're like, oh yeah, that is exactly what these people say, so it's been interesting to see kind of from different people's experiences of it. Yeah.
I don't know if it's because I read A River of Golden Bones before I read The High Mountain Court, but I definitely saw like non-binary trends in Remy too, and I was like, oh, and it's like not important to her at all as a person. It's just like, she doesn't have to be boxed in, you know?
Totally. And I think that's part of her experience too, and I think that just a lot of people kind of view that the High Mountain Court as like not really a queer book because it's a character who ends up with a man. And and for me, I'm like, I always wrote her to be queer and to be bi as well. And it's funny because a lot of people will be like, I'm like, she's clearly checking out Brie in like the first half of the book. Like she's very into her, but is distracted by this other person. And people are like, oh, well, she's just appreciating her friend's body. Like that. And I always crack up. I'm like, interesting. We might need to unpack that later.
This is like the archaeology where it's two men in a grave holding
Yeah.
hands. They're just such good friends.
They're just really good friends who wanted to hold each other in bed as they were passing. Yeah, yeah, exactly. Well, because I do think that a lot of authors feel the need that they have to very explicitly say there has to be this like one obligatory line of like, oh, I like girls and boys, or like I like all genders, or all of these things. And for me, I'm like, or we could just like write queer characters existing, but because so many people still are almost kind of like stuck in this thinking of like, well, I'll decide their sexuality based on who they end up with.
Yeah.
Um, we still sometimes need that in order for people to even realize like, this was always a queer character. And with the second book, The Witch's Blade, Rua is a little bit more overtly pansexual in the books, but also the character of Renwick, he has a novella where you realize more that he's demisexual and that he's kind of surrounded as a younger man by all these kind of kings and powerful people who really are kind of grossly manipulative and aggressive towards women. And it feels like he's missing a part of himself because he doesn't have those kind of sexual desires. And but because you only meet him from the Witch's Blade, you just assume because he's in one romance that like all of his previous life must have been the same way. So I just kind of want to use my stories to challenge those kind of notions a little bit. Yeah.
When I was going to school, I went to school for anthropology, and one of the one of the guys in my course was doing a study on sexuality, and he said one of the main things that he finds with surveys is if you ask, "Are you gay or bi?" they'll typically go with whatever partner they're with now because society tells them that's what they are.
Yeah.
And so I love the exploration and like the just like, it's just gently sprinkled.
Yeah, yeah, it's almost like we're tiptoeing into it. By the time we get to the evergreen era, we're like, "Okay, you're on board now." I really want people to meet Nilo in the first book, who's this, like, kind of gorgeously nerdy, non-binary bookworm, and I think people from the very first book really wanted to know more about them, and then I think it might have been a harder sell to get people to immediately take that book up first,
Yeah,
especially because they use they them pronouns. And I think that for some people, like they won't even try to
yeah.
read those stories. But because they fell in love with Nilo in the first book, they're like, okay, I'll give it a go. And I love how many people by the end of the story will message me and say, I feel so much more comfortable using they, them pronouns now because I've read this whole story with it and it felt like a really safe place to kind of like learn and explore and feel more confident in it. And I'm like, that's amazing. Like that's the goal of storytelling, you know? So yeah.
But also, Nilo gets a relationship at all, which
Mhm.
is fantastic to me, is like not just putting them by the wayside. Um,
Right.
so
Yeah.
I loved that.
I didn't want all of the queer characters to just be like the side characters who forward the straight character's plot, you know? I wanted them all to be like, actually, we all have complex relationships and we all get to be the heroes of our own stories and we all have, different ways of being. And I remember, like, gosh, probably 15 years ago now, maybe longer, sitting around in a cafe with all of my kind of nerdy book nerd friends and obsessed with Tolkien and all of these like fantastical worlds, but like none of us could see ourselves as the main characters of these stories. And I from that day onward, I was like, we've got to be the main characters. If ever I publish a book, I'm bringing you all with me. You're all going to be in my books.
So one of the other things too is these are not closed door fantasy or romantasies. They are very much sexually explicit, which is fantastic for queer characters. But because I haven't read Nilo's book yet, how do you deal with a non-binary character and sexually explicit scenes?
Yeah, well, so I didn't want it to be like this kind of mystery where
Yeah,
it's like, because I think sometimes non-binary people are treated like they only exist from like the neck up,
yeah,
And I think for particularly for certain people, there's like it's usually like skinny white people who kind of get away with this androgyny that oh well they can be a mystery and people they're almost treated like these kind of Ken dolls that have nothing going on
yeah,
and it's like I feel like it kind of almost treats them like they're not people and it kind of separates them from their bodies in a way where they have to feel almost like disconnected or dysphoric in their bodies in order to like feel like they can claim their gender.
yeah.
And so for me, I wanted it to be very clearly like, this is what I've got going on. This is my body. And I was someone who like loves my body, but also like sees me so completely that they would never misgender me for knowing what I have going on under my clothes. And so because I think in Nilo's book you do explore a little bit more their kind of hesitance to be naked and things like that because they don't want to be misgendered. And it's interesting because people misgendered Nilo one way for the first three books, like readers in the fandom. And then after this book, we'll misgender them another way. And I find that really interesting where, um, it's kind of like the whole point of this book was that you can't judge people based on what they've
Yeah.
got going on under their clothes. But yeah, I think it was hopefully a lesson for some people to not do that and to not assume that they know?
Yeah. I just love that you explore it at all. Because I feel
Yeah.
like so often it's just ignored or it's too difficult to wrap your head around. So not that authors aren't willing to tackle it, it's just difficult.
Well,
So
I actually, when I was first starting out, I had some authors before any of the books came out encourage me not to have include their story, because they said it's not palatable to a wide
yeah,
enough audience and that not enough people will want to read it. And I thought, well, like, what's the point of me being an author if I
yeah,
can't if I can't see myself and my pronouns and my existence in any of the worlds that I write because it's not palatable to enough people. And so I thought, kind of hold my beer, like challenge accepted. I will definitely do that then. And I want, my goal is to have more people kind of see themselves in these worlds. And I can't do that if I'm only trying to write to appease
yeah,
people who are outside of me. So it was very important to me to keep their story and their pronouns in the series. And it was very exciting when the series started off self-published and was bought by Harper Voyager, and just their excitement and encouragement of telling these stories and giving them an even wider platform. So that was really awesome.
it's amazing that these were self-published before they were published because they're so refined and they're like very succinct, which is not always the case when you don't have a whole lot of beta readers or editors. So
I
it's
think that's
fantastic.
the ADHD in me too, that I tend to be like, okay, now on to the next thing. Like I want a highlight reel of a story. And so I actually often have to go in and encourage myself to add more detail and more of the world because I I write my stories almost like I've gathered my friends around, a campfire, and I'm like, okay, you have to hear about this. So there's this girl and she's in the forest and.
All right, I want the narration.
Yeah, yeah. And then it kind of expands from there. But I'd been thinking about self-publishing for a really, really long time. So I ended up having many, editors, beta readers, lots of people's hands on the book before it came out, the first two books, before it was picked up. So, because I really wanted to, show what I could do and what I could write. And I thought, for sure I would be shouting into the void and maybe two people would read the book, and I didn't expect it to take off the way it did. So yeah, it was incredible.
I think especially after Travis Baldry's Legends and Lattes came out, publishers realized there is an audience for this. Like you've
Totally.
been missing a whole subsection of the world.
Yes, absolutely. And I think there's such a kind of rabid audience who's like, more, please, who will buy, anything, like if there's for me, like with sapphic books, whenever I see a sapphic book come out, I'm like, instant read, sapphic romantasy done, sold. And it's like, I think that, I would love to see more non-binary and trans fantasy romance stories because I feel like we're just starting to see those. And still, I think there's kind of the sense that there's like two types of queer romance and no others. So I would love to just kind of see this ever expanding landscape of queer stories and fantasy for sure.
Well, I love that you're actually putting them out too and not just waiting for them like I am. So we need the people
Thanks.
to write them.
Yeah, well, and I mean, like, I can't help myself. I get so excited about like, "Ooh, and then we could do this," and, I love telling stories, and it's an honor that people like to read them, so, yeah.
Well, what are you working on next?
Ooh, well, so I've just finished the last book in, the Golden Court trilogy, so the last book in the River of Golden Bones world, which is a sapphic book. It's very a spicy sapphic,
Mhm.
and dark too, in a way that I feel like a lot of sapphic books are very soft and feminine, which is gorgeous, but, like, sometimes we want dark and spicy too.
Yes, we do.
So, yeah, I had a lot of fun writing that one, and, the second book in that series comes out this year, and then that will come out next year, and I'm deviating wildly now to write my 3rd Zookeeper rom-com, which is also sapphic, fake dating, and I love that it has a butch main character because I feel like we don't often get butch representation in sapphic books, especially in rom-coms for some reason. It's quite often femme for femme. Um, and so I'm having fun with that. And then I'm starting the next fantasy book, which is all top secret right now.
Do you have a contract with Harper Voyager going forward?
Not currently. We will see what comes next. Yeah.
I'm sure they'll pick it up.
We shall see what happens. But yeah, I'm definitely in my sapphic era right now. So we'll see what comes of that. But for me, it's I think all of my fantasies going forward will have queer main characters. So yeah, those are the stories I love to tell.
So part of me is like, I'm sorry, all we did was talk about queer representation and not like the
Oh, I love
story,
it.
but like also it's important.
Yes, it is. And sometimes I've really loved this conversation because sometimes interviewers want to kind of shy away from those
Yeah.
subjects. And so I love that we've had the opportunity to talk about that. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with me today and for writing such great queer romance.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
So the last book, The Amethyst Kingdom, is out May 14th.
Yes.
Yeah. And I highly encourage everybody to go check it out. I'm gonna have to go check out your Patreon now too. Uh, so I want those novellas.
Yeah, I think there's like gosh, 8 or 9 on there now. Yeah.
And then I saw on your website that you also do signed book plates. So that's pretty
Yeah.
nifty. All right. Well, thank you so much for talking with me tonight. And I hope everybody goes and reads these books because they're beautiful and wonderful and fun.